Today we are going to break bread together. Someone has outlined the perennial Christian strategy as gather the folks, break the bread, and tell the stories. If you take the time to leaf through the pages of the Bible, you can't help but notice that there is a considerable amount of eating and drinking and storytelling going on. There is a whole lot of theology of food in the scriptures. The first instance of eating gets us into trouble, you may remember. It seems that whenever something important takes place, there is eating and drinking. The wedding at Cana, the feeding of the 5,000, the Passover, and such. And today's text from 1 Kings. Though today's text is not a banquet. But in all of this eating and drinking, we find there was more than just refueling the body. And so I want to talk about that a little. Mostly from 1 Kings, but a little piece towards the end from Mark. I have picked the story of the widow of Zarephath and also the widow's mite because they are both about risky generosity. Kevin told me that you've been talking about Old Testament stories lately. So today, from 1 Kings, we are going to speak from the middle of it. There are actually 3 stories in this text. All of chapter 17. God sends the ravens to feed Elijah in the first part. God sends Elijah to the widow of Zarephath, which we just read. And the end of this chapter is about the death and the resuscitation of the widow's son. Now, I know we're not going to be here for too long, so I can't do all 3. Anyway, we come to church, you and I, through the mysterious call of God's Spirit working in our hearts and minds and souls. Coming perhaps by the invitation of a friend, or something we read in the Bible, or as a response to some crisis in our lives, or just to fill our emptiness, to make some sense out of the world, and even out of curiosity. But by whatever means God chooses to ignite the spark, God steers our feet to the church, where we find out that despite our weaknesses, our various personalities, our different gifts and such, God's Spirit calls us to be one people. It is to this motley crew called the church that God calls us to be committed. Committed by way of risky generosity. So let's begin with 2 questions. Suppose you were the widow of Zarephath. What was it like in those days? Briefly, Ahab has been raising hell during the time of the kings. And there is a drought in the land because God has dried up the land. Elijah, the prophet, is speaking against Ahab. And Ahab wants to kill him. Elijah is on the run. On the run to the Wadi Cherith at God's direction, and before he gets there, he is fed by the ravens. But the wadi eventually dries up, and God sends Elijah to Zarephath, to the widow, to an outsider, someone who has no stake in what goes on in the politics of the time. Now, if you have visited some of the poorer countries of the world, you might be reminded of this scene from 1 Kings. It is unfortunately much too easy to visualize the widow wandering around the dried up areas looking for a few sticks to use for cooking what little food she has. It is easy to believe that whatever meal she cooks for herself and her son will be their last meal. And all the while she's trying to survive, her government, or somebody else's government, is keeping food from her. This scene in 1 Kings resonates all too easily in both obvious and subtle ways with much that is happening in our world today. The world's leaders, political and otherwise, the whole lot of them, I'm not taking any sides here, so don't get that out. But the whole lot of them, even though some try, they refuse to take definitive, positive action in regard to peace, in regard to the homeless, in regard to the poor, the elderly, the veterans, to the environment, to refugees, worldwide problems that are too numerous to mention. Instead, leaders, worldwide and domestic, act like a bunch of kids. This comes from a former teacher, by the way. They act like a bunch of kids having a fight on a school playground. The prophets of the Old Testament speak about these differences between those in power who have and the powerless who had not. That's the scene. That's the scene portrayed by the writer of 1 Kings, and there is more truth in it than we would like to admit. And suppose, just suppose this truth pierces our minds and our hearts. What can we do about it anyway? By ourselves, probably not much. But with God, see what happens with some risky generosity. See what happens with a handful of meal, a little oil, and a couple of sticks. A Sidonian woman, a widow, an outcast, and her son, a Gentile woman with no connection at all to Ahab or Israel, an outcast on all counts. This is the person whom God has chosen to sustain the prophet Elijah in his battle with Ahab. The widow of Zarephath was more in a condition to receive help than to give help when God sent Elijah to her. It was easy for a hungry vagrant to impose on this woman. And she gets over her objections, any objections that she might have. And she went and did as Elijah said. And he and she and her household ate for many days. The jar of meal was not spent, neither did the cruse of oil fail, according to the word of the Lord, which spoke to Elijah. I suppose that there have been times in your life when you didn't think you had enough to make it. Enough money, enough to eat, enough courage, enough faith, enough of whatever that you needed at that time. There are times in our lives when we seem to be facing impossible demands, as we may well be doing that now. And here I am standing in the pulpit and you're sitting in the pews, and there are billions of people in the world with all their problems, and we with ours, and we have limited resources. I mean, in this day and age, what are our limited means in the face of all those needs? What is a couple of sticks, a handful of meal, and a little oil? It is enough to make anybody feel inadequate and faced with an impossible task. Because on paper, we have limited resources and infinite possibilities. We know all too well that the problems will not be solved by me standing here and you sitting here. But do you know what God does? God calls for the most incredible kind of risky generosity. The generosity that does away with any sense of inadequacy that we might feel about our limited resources. We take inventory and we come up short. And our natural reaction is to protect those 2 sticks and that little bit of meal and a few drops of oil, so that I may go home and prepare for myself and my son, so that we may eat it and die, the widow told Elijah. But do you see what God does? God does it, not us. The power of God does it, not us. The power of God takes our limited resources and blesses them. And every time that we return to God what is God's, we always seem to find more. At least that is the way that it has been, if we are willing to take the risk. Now there's a lot that can be mined from 1 Kings 17. But as in all stories, take what you need from the story of the widow of Zarephath. And now, briefly, in the Gospel of Mark, you have the widow with 2 coins. Another outsider. 2 pennies, if you will. Though in those days they might have bought a piece of bread, a jar of meal, and a cruse of oil. But the widow pushes the question of faith. She pushes the question of risky generosity. The question of wealth and ownership and power, and she pushes to the deepest level. She gives all that she has to God. And you remember Jesus was just sitting there and watching. You also may be happy to know that Jesus took a hard shot at the clergy wearing robes and strutting around and such. But he did not condemn the gifts of those who came by. No denunciation of wealth, but he did say, "Truly I tell you, this poor widow has put in more than all those who are contributing to the treasury." Jesus said this about the woman, the widow, who probably contributed to her next meal. In the sight of God, who looks into our hearts, that was big business. These 2 coins have proven to be one of the world's best known financial transactions, whether you're a Christian or you're not. I would even guess that Stephen Hawking knows it. But the Bible makes clear that giving is risky generosity, not surplus generosity. Once again, take what you need from the story. I know enough about you to know that this church tries to lead you through the stories of the Bible. On this lazy 4th of July summer weekend, my simple word to you is that risky generosity is more than money, more than the marketing mind. My simple word to you today is that risky generosity means all of you, your whole being. My simple word to all of us is that God loves us too much to let us stay the way we are. As we come to the communion table, my simple word to you is that the riskiest gift ever given was the birth, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Thanks be to God.